All right, you guys. God with us. Encountering Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. God with us. So we started reading chapter 1, okay? And, from reading the chapter 1 of the book, but from reading chapter 1 of the actual Gospel of Matthew, we just see that it's primarily the genealogy. When at a first glance, it's just the genealogy of Jesus that goes all the way back through from Abraham, okay? But, the author really tries to drive home the importance of us looking at this from the perspective of a first century Jewish person who it was written for, who would be reading it. Because otherwise we would wonder, I think we would wonder the significance of listing all of these, people down through the centuries, right? But he does say that this would have had more attention-grabbing power than any video or any hashtag trending on social media. That in just this few verses here, it summed up all their history and all of their hope in just a few lines. It was their identity, their history, and their future. That basically the story of Jesus is the story of Israel from the past, and it is the story of the church for the future. So, he really shows the connections with David, but why David? Because David, it was from the line of David that so much was promised. I read here too that just some interesting things that, what did it say about that David and Jesus were the only two in that whole litany of people that were actually given titles? David, let's see, what does it say? David was called king, and then Jesus was called the Christ, or the anointed one. We discussed the other day how Christ wasn't his middle name. Christ, it was the Christ. Christ means the anointed one. And that was a title given to any Davidic king whenever he was anointed at his coronation. The word coronation simply means the crowning. It would have been at the ceremony where they were crowned. Okay, that's whenever anyone in the Davidic line would have been called the Christ. So Jesus, from very early on, gained the name the Christ, the anointed one. Just subtle things that if you don't have from this perspective, we would just gloss over it and not even realize that, right? Very much the significance of the 14 generations, the 14, 14, and 14, how all that symbolism, there's so much rich symbolism in the Jewish culture, and the numbers, how numbers have such significance. But we also see where the consonant sounds, the D, the W, and the D, that their sounds also have a numerical value, and that would have added together to make 14. And then there's the three sections. So it's the thrice Davidic son of David. Just so much deeper meaning there with why it was laid out that way, that you would have just glossed right over that. But why David? God promised David and his descendants an everlasting dynasty. I recommend that whenever we're going through this book, that you take some time to go back through the references to the Old Testament. This is how we see that the Old Testament is revealed in the New Testament, and the New Testament is concealed in the Old. It's just this it's this correlation between old and new. It didn't come from nowhere, and even when I went and was looking at 2 Samuel, and this is where I think that many times we've just been falling throughout Christianity and struggling in this world. Whenever I was reading 2 Samuel, when I was looking in my annotations, there was a reference to 1 Maccabees. Well, 1 500 years ago, that was one of the books of the Bible that was removed. And so, you know, it's a very significant line out of First Maccabees that references David. And so it's just like, we really have to continue to press in, and a study of history is the study of the church all the way back, you know. Even, we just have to make sure that we're not being fooled, okay? Or that pieces of our history are not being removed right in front of our eyes, all right? But God had many promises to David and through David for the future. And this is, you know, where he promised even to send a king, that one day a new son of David would come, someone who would rescue God's people from their enemies, restore the kingdom, and extend its reign to all nations. You know, in Isaiah, I just love this back and forth, you know, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. I can get lost there, which is a little bit of what happened while I was late coming on, you know. But, you know, when you go to Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 through 10, I mean, it's, but a shoot shall sprout up from the stump of Jesse. And this is where we get all of the gifts of the Spirit that we study from Isaiah. A spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, a spirit of wisdom and of understanding, a spirit of counsel and strength, a spirit of knowledge and a fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be the fear of the Lord. You know, just how much depth there is to this back and forth from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and how we can really look at Scripture in a whole new way. Remember, God speaks to us through the Scriptures. So I really encourage you to go back in and look at those Old Testament references, and then just to go back and just to see how just simply one line in the New Testament, just like we see that, you know, he talks about that in that verse 11, how one line of the New Testament can have so many different references of the Old Testament. But, you know, the New Testament, it's the new word. It's the fulfillment of all of the prophecies and the promises of the Old Testament. I like the way that he likens this going through, Jesus's genealogy. He has some musical references there when he talks about going through this, and how, you know, the first couple of the first 14 would have really built some hope, and then, you know, he goes through some more and he gets to, like, bam, this somber note, because, you know, they would have been built up, but then it was like the time whenever the Davidic kingdom was like dethroned, and they had to go into Babylonian exile. You know, do we really even think about that whenever we read the beginning of Matthew? You know, but what would it have been? You know, this is our history. You think about some of the history that we go through, and how there can be times in history that really just pierce us deep into our core. That's what would have been happening whenever these first century Jewish people would have been reading this. They would have been reminded of, you know, the tragedy in their story, the end of the Davidic monarchy. You know, that also sets for us a timeline, you know, that happened in 586 BC, you know, and so we know that from history. We know that from the documentation, you know, and in the Scriptures. So it's a painful memory. And then, you know, for most of the 6 centuries that follow, it would have been their oppression, but and they would have not had a king sitting on the throne, you know. But then there's the promises. Jesus makes those promises, and so go back and look at, you know, Deuteronomy and 2 Kings. God was always extending, always attempting to make a covenant with his people. And the difference, you know, in a covenant and a contract is an exchange of persons. A contract or an agreement is more of a legal term, but God was making a covenant with his people. He was always seeking to reconcile his people back to himself, you know. So, you know, during this time of that Babylonian exile, which is just mentioned, just one sentence, you know, just one little verse there, but it would have really taken these people who were reading this on an emotional journey, you know. And just very interesting that the genealogy stops with what's that guy's Zerubbabel. Okay, it just stops there. So they would have then immediately be given hope whenever that genealogy would have continued in the Old Testament. it stopped with that man right there. But then Matthew comes in and he lists those next future generations there. So their hope is building again. And what they know, because they know the scriptures, they're faithful Jewish people. They know the scriptures. So they know that their God has promised, because the prophets had spoken for God, that their God has promised to send a king, and so here their hope is building again, and they can't help but wonder, is the king that's been promised going to be at the end of this litany of people, so there again, it builds momentum. So we're looking at this from the, we know that there's already been a king, okay, but we're looking at it through the eyes of the people for which it was written. So there's the climax of the whole genealogy. Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah who God had foretold would restore the kingdom and bring to completion his plan of blessing the entire world. It's a lot of back and forth, with the scriptures, but definitely dive in. I mean, that's a way of praying through the scriptures instead of just getting in to, just reading it like it's a storybook. There's nothing wrong with that, but really looking back through and just seeing what was going on in the Old Testament and what are the promises that were made. I mean, it helps us to enter into the scriptures. What impressions do most people have of biblical genealogies? Probably any genealogy. If it's not your own, why is it of interest, So we've already talked about what it would have meant to them. What did the prophets say about the future son of David? It encourages us to look into Isaiah, Micah, and Jeremiah. There, I have to be honest with you, I got lost down a rabbit hole and I didn't have time to look through those. So I'm going to sit right here and do that, after we get off of this live this morning. What are the various ways the genealogy in Matthew 1 draws attention to Jesus as being the long-awaited Davidic king? Consider the following verses. So he takes us very slowly back through the verses of Matthew chapter 1, verses 1, 16, 17, and then 13 through 16. And he gives a really good explanation of that, And I feel like at the beginning, we're just getting some historical context here for Matthew. Keep in mind that, these writers of the day, they're recording the story of Jesus. The synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are actually, the gospels are one story. They're the story of Jesus Christ told from different perspectives, but also in many ways written for different audiences, okay? So Matthew is written for this first century Jewish person, and this type of stuff would have been very important. This would have been very important at the beginning so that for the credibility of the word that was to come afterwards, okay? You have to, it's just like today, they were looking at it through scrutinizing eyes, and so it would have had to have had enough information that would have been deemed credible for them to have listened, okay? So we have to keep that in mind. So, Matthew, Mark, and Luke from a different perspective, and John, but John is a different type of literature. John is way more spiritual, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell this story of Jesus Christ from a different perspective, so and for this audience, so it would have been very important. But I feel like that, he's just setting us up in this historical context so that we know that what's coming is valid, okay? So why don't we just tomorrow, finish reading chapter 1 and back and forth, into the Old Testament, and then go through these discussion questions and just, ponder them for yourself. Feel free. Let's discuss this in the comments. If there's anything that really stuck out to you, anything that you've seen in a new way, I definitely want us to, dialogue about that. And then we can finish up the last two tomorrow, and hopefully we'll just work our way into a nice rhythm with going through this book. And maybe everybody will get their books in. It's available for immediate download on Amazon. You can get it in in the Kindle format. And if you order the hard copy book, then I think you can get the first couple of chapters. But God with Us, Encountering Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. We're looking at Matthew because, liturgically, this is the cycle that we're in the church. And in many mainline Christian churches, not just the Catholic Church, this is the year that we dive into the Gospel of Matthew. And so, although we do that for a year, we'll be finishing up and starting Mark at Advent right before Christmas, like at the beginning of December. So it's perfect timing for us to really dive into Matthew and let God speak to us. I foresee that we'll be encountering the scriptures that we're actually hearing at the Sunday liturgy in a whole new way. So that's my hope there. Hope you guys enjoy diving in. If you need a Bible, or if you want a Bible, there's a couple people that I'm sending a Bible to. Feel free to drop it in or send me a private message, or drop it in the comments, and I'll send a Bible to you that has all of the books in it. The ones that were removed about 500 years ago, I'll gladly send you a Bible that has all of those books. So, God bless you, and I'll see you guys tomorrow morning at 7 a.m.